to where it is. It ain't just about politics. We're going to add some Bible scripture in here. We're going to go back to the future. And stay with me because we're diving into a moment that flipped the script on American politics faster than you can say New Deal. So stay with me, guys. It's April 12th, 1937. And guess what's happening? The Supreme Court drops a bombshell. It's the National Labor Relations Board versus Jones and Laughlin Steel Corp. And guess what? It's been upheld. And here's the boom. The switch in time that saved 9. And that's what is known in history. And it's born. But why does it matter for us today? Well, it matters for us today significantly. I'm trying to get this art so you guys can see this. Okay. How does it echo? And what does it mean? Well, the switch in time that saved 9 was born April 12th, 1937. And why does it matter? Well, because it echoes through the halls of history and maybe even heaven itself. So grab your popcorn, folks, because we're going to unpack this like a treasure chest. From the founding fathers who sprinkled it a little bit, we will, with some biblical wisdom and a dash of today's political spice. All right, let's set the stage. It's 1930, and America is reeling from the Great Depression. Picture this: bread lines, dust storms, and more despair than a country song on repeat. Who's the president? Franklin D. Roosevelt. And he rolls out what's called the New Big Deal. It's a big government buffet of jobs, regulations, safety nets. But here is the catch, and it's a big catch. So, I mean, where is this at here? These safety nets are rolled out and all these jobs under Franklin D. Roosevelt. But the big catch, the Supreme Court, packed with old school justices, keep swatting down his laws like flies at a picnic. They're all about limited government, state rights, and keeping Congress in its lane. Sound familiar? Well, that's because it is. The eternal tug of war between the control and between our freedom. See, FDR gets spicy, and he actually threatens to pack the court and add more justices to tip the scales. And the judiciary branch freaks out. Again, April 12th, 1937. A lot of history that I wasn't taught in school, were you guys? So Justin Owens Roberts is his name, Justice Owen Roberts. He flips his vote in the Jones-Laughlin case, and the court upholds the National Labor Relations Act, green-lighting the federal power over labor and the economy. Historians call it the switch in time that saved 9, which is why we have 9 Supreme Court justices still, because it actually kept FDR from rewriting the judicial playbook. 9 justices stayed put, but the game, it changed forever. For you, for me, for our children, for our grandchildren. Now, let's break into what the good book says, because nothing's good without looking at the good book. Proverbs 21:1 says, "The king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he will." Think about that. Justice Robert has his mind made up, and then he switches it. Was it just politics? It was, for sure, a pivot in the river of history, guided by something bigger. This was not about steel mills or union dues. It was about power. It was about people and providence. And Ecclesiastes 3:1 tells us, for everything there's a season and a time and a moment. For every matter under heaven. So in 1937, America's season shifted from rugged individualism to where you could rule yourself to a collective action. Now the government stepped in to be our king. Still happening today. And here's why it matters. Before the switch, the court clung to the old vibe. Hands off the economy. Let the states figure it out. The states had way more power than the federal government. The feds could regulate the wages, the hours, even how you bargain with your boss, all because of this law. Imagine telling a farmer in 1930 that Washington, D.C. could dictate his hired hands, who he paid. Imagine that. Well, he'd laugh you right off the porch. But after this law in 1937, that's the new normal. It's a lifeline for workers crushed by the depression, some say. Sure. But was it also a power grab that echoes into today? I mean, a lot of individual power was gave up. The government used to be for the people, by the people. And this law flipped the government to control the people. Look at Psalms 146:3. It says, "Put not your trust in princes, in a son of man in whom there is no salvation." The New Deal asked Americans to trust their government like they had never before. Now, I've been to some of these history places where you can look at some of the things that FDR and the New Deal bill, and they're massive and they're grand. I'm sure they employed people, but I had no idea how much personal power the people lost. For everything gained, there's something lost. So fast forward to 2020. Are you guys still with me? Yeah, I knew that would happen. I'm telling you, if you do not get this today, you look that up yourself. You go look up what happened on these dates that I'm mentioning and these laws that I'm talking about. So we're still wrestling with this beast today, guys. Today in our politics, it's a remix of this very moment. Progressives cheer centralized power to fix inequality. Conservatives cry foul. And guess what? The Constitution, both of them are clutching to it like a shield. And here's the kicker. Both sides claim divine power, the shield. And here's the kicker. Both sides claim divine power, divine backing from it. Oh, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's and to God the things that are God. Gets tossed around like a football at Thanksgiving, which if you want to read that, it's Matthew 22:1. So where are we going as a nation? As we barrel toward are we barreling toward even more of a nanny state where Uncle Sam tucks us in at night? Or are we due for a backlash, a return to every man for himself? History does say it's a pendulum swing. And the switch in 1937, tilted us toward Caesar. But the Bible, and maybe even common sense, warns us not to forget God's lane. Proverbs 29:8 says, "Where there's no vision, the people perish." Our vision is blurry, without a doubt, folks. We're split on what America should be, a protector or a referee. This is not just a dusty history, it's a mirror. The switch that saved 9 was a choice. Security over freedom. Unity over chaos. Or maybe just pragmatics over principle. Today we're choosing 2. Every election, every law, every post that you do on social media, screaming about socialism, screaming about tyranny. It's 1937 all over again, just with memes. So here is the homework to any patriots. Listen. Ask yourself, who's turning the stream of water? Is it God, the government, us? The switch in time that just saved 9, those 9 justices, it redefined a nation. And where it takes us next, well, that's on you. That's on me. Let's keep the conversation rolling. As I said, we're going to do a little history here. Because if history and scripture teach us anything, it's the story is never over. So 1937, the Supreme Court frequently struck down the New Deal programs under Franklin D. Roosevelt. They argued with him, saying they exceeded the federal power. 1937, FDR even threatened to pack the courts, proposing adding more justices who would support his policies. Justice Owen Roberts suddenly shifted his stance and he voted to uphold the New Deal, avoiding what they called then, and you'll hear it in today's news, the constitutional crisis. The ruling expanded federal power over commerce and labor, and it fundamentally altered the court's approach to economic regulations. And why is this seen as lawless? Critics argue that the court effectively rewrote the Constitution without a formal amendment. What this did is allowed Congress to expand its federal power beyond its intended limits. It set a precedent for judicial activism, where the court interrupts rather than strictly applies the Constitution. The long-term effects of the Supreme Court 1937 shift. Now, this decision was NLRB versus Jones and Laughlin Steel Corp, April 12th, 1937, if you want to dig deeper yourself. It had profound effects on the U.S. governance, judicial power, and the balance between federal and state authorities. Here's how. It expanded the federal government. Before 1937, the Commerce Clause, which was Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, was interpreted narrowly, limiting all the federal government's role in regulating business and labor. Pre-1937, the court struck down federal laws that attempted to regulate working conditions, wages, and industrial practices. 1937, the court ruled that post-1937, that even economic activities could be regulated if they had a substantial effect or interstate commerce. This actually set the stage for vast federal oversight, including laws like the Civil Rights of 1964, which relied on the Commerce Clause to prohibit racial discrimination in businesses. This law also, the judicial difference to Congress and the executive branch, the court had historically acted as a check on federal overreach. After 1937, it stopped striking down most economic regulations. It began adopting a philosophy of judicial restraint, meaning it deferred more and more to Congress instead of back to the states. Over time, this law allowed federal agencies like the EPA, the FDA, and the IRS to gain massive regulatory power. After making rules without direct congressional approval, the shift laid the foundation for bureaucratic expansion, where unlimited officials and agencies shaped the national policy. The New Deal became permanent. The court's 1937 decision saved key New Deal programs and established precedents that allowed future government expansion. Like Social Security in 1935 survived legal challenges and became a cornerstone of government welfare programs. Minimum wage and labor laws gained strong federal backing. Welfare entitlement programs, later expanded like Medicaid and Medicare, rested on the legal foundations that were all laid in this ruling in 1937. Essentially, this ruling helped create the modern welfare state that we have all grew up in. Rise of the administrative state. With the court stepping back from limited government power, federal agencies began functioning almost like a fourth branch of government. Agencies were now able to interpret and enforce laws with less oversight from Congress or from the courts. Regulations increased dramatically, affecting business, healthcare, the environment, and education. all from this 1937 law, the New Deal. Presidents, both Democrat and Republican, use the executive order more frequently, with a lot of laws, as we'll get into, that we actually use today, knowing the court would likely uphold. So yes, we lost more power. From judicial activism, it started. While the courts initially leaned toward restraint, well, this 1937 law paved the way for future judicial activism. Take a look at 1950 and 60. The Warren Court took this even further, using the Constitution, their version, with this new law, to justify broad rulings on civil rights, criminal procedures, and free speech. Roe versus Wade would have not been a 1973 decision on abortion. It would have not been without this law. Obamacare survival 2012 relied on the broad federal power over commerce and taxation, which also strengthened this post-1937 law. It was actually a turning point in what we know as constitutional interpretation. Again, you can study it more. The year was April 12th, that's the exact day, 1937 decision. It did not formally amend the Constitution, but it redefined how the court interpreted it. The original intent of the founders was limited government and state sovereignty. After 1937, the federal government became the dominant force in regulating the economy, regulating social policy, and even personal lives. The shift eroded state rights and gave rise to the massive federal bureaucracy that we have today. This moment remains one of the most controversial in U.S. legal history, and it's seen by some as the necessary adoption and by others a judicial coup that permanently weakened the Constitution, limited state powers, and gave the federal government more. How the Supreme Court's 1937 ruling shifted and the effects of policies that we have today. Let's dive a little deeper. The decision from April 12, 1937 drastically changed how the federal government operates, giving it unprecedented power over economies and social policies. And that shift does impact us in major areas today. It affects us in healthcare. It gave federal control over medical policies. Before 1937, healthcare was almost entirely state regulated. The shift allowed massive federal involvement, leading to programs like Medicaid and Medicare in 1965. These programs rely on the Commerce Clause and the General Welfare Clause, which were reinterpreted post-1937 law to justify national healthcare spending. Before 1937, these programs might have been ruled unconstitutional for exceeding federal authority. The Founding Fathers never intended for it to be a nanny state, and that's how this was looked at before 1937. Today, the federal government controls a huge portion of healthcare funding, limiting state flexibility. Obamacare, Affordable Care Act 2010. It upheld again by the Supreme Court because Congress has broad power to tax, a principle strengthened by 1937. Interesting, another deep dive about taxes. We used to not be taxed, and we used to not have to pay property taxes either. So let's stick to this though. Mandates and regulations. The federal government now requires insurance companies to cover pre-existing conditions, contraceptives, and more. Healthcare costs has obviously rose, but more people are actually uninsured. If the court had not changed its interpretation in 1937, it's possible healthcare would still be regulated mostly at the state level, with private industry playing a larger role. Number two way it affected education, federal overreach into the schools. See, originally, education was a state responsibility, but after this 1937 ruling, the federal government expanded its influence. through federal funding control. Whoever pays the bills controls. Elementary and Secondary Education Act 1965. It gave the federal money for public schools, tying funding to federal regulations. So again, if they pay the bills, they get to make the rules. So in 2001, No Child Left Behind became a rule, imposing national testing standards and reduced state control more over educational policy. Common Core was then introduced in 2010, and it pushed national academic standards through state resistance. Guys, if you don't mind, please thumbs it up just so other people can find it. Share it with your friends. It's so much history, and it's not my opinion. You can go look up anything I say here, and it's all been researched. Originally, in title, let's see, it was 1972, Gender and Athletic Regulations, originally meant to prevent the discrimination, but today it dictates policies on sexual misconduct, sport participation, and LGBTQ and issues. The Biden administration expanded this, protecting it to include gender identity, forcing schools that they had to comply with the federal policies, or guess what? Lost their funding. Without the 1937 court shift, the federal government would likely have little say in local school policies today. It also affected, number 3, business and economic regulations. See, there was an explosion of federal bureaucracy. Before 1937, businesses were mostly regulated by states, and now federal agencies dictate policies in nearly every single industry. So there's massive federal regulatory agencies. Even OSHA was 1970, Occupation Safety and Health Administration. It regulated the workplace conditions. And then the EPA was 1970. It controlled emissions, energy policy, and land use. And the CFPB 2010, which is the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, it regulated banking and lending, but all without this 1937 law that the Supreme Court decided to do. This would have not been possible. It would have been against the Constitution. In 2010, OSHA attempted to mandate COVID-19 vaccines, which prevented businesses from keeping you hired. It actually cited the Commerce Clause, so you had to take the vaccine or you would lose your job. The Supreme Court struck it down, but this kind of overreach is only possible because of the post-1937 legal doctrines that seem to overturn some of our Constitution. Taxation and inflation. Before 1937, income tax rates were lower and the federal budget was much smaller. After 1937 in the New Deal, government spending skyrocketed with trillions spent on welfare, subsidies, and regulations. Let me see if I can switch this again. There we go. And today, massive federal deficits and inflation are partly due to governments that no longer have constitutional spending limits. Civil rights is number 4, and social policies, federal power over state laws. The 1937 ruling shifted, and it allowed federal intervention into civil rights, voting, and social issues that were once upheld by the states. Civil rights 1964 and voting rights 1965 used the Commerce Clause to justify banning segregation in private businesses, allowed federal oversight of state elections, and later scaled back in 2013. Roe versus Wade, 1973, and same-sex marriage, 2015. These rulings would not have been possible without the broad federal powers that was established in 1937 and throughout part of the Constitution. Regardless of what you think about it, it's the fact, and you can go look the dates up. Gun control federal laws would be number 5, the way it affects us today. Overrode the state rights. The Gun Control Act was not introduced until 1968. and later regulated, heavily restricted firearm sales and ownership, citing the Commerce Clause again. The Biden administration actually pushed for federal red flag laws restricting gun owners based on vague threats. Before 1937, these laws would have been struck down as violations of the Second and the 10th Amendment, which was all about state rights. The federal government controls nearly everything because of the 1937 Supreme Court shift. Today, the federal government controls healthcare, education, business, and even several of the social policies. States have little control in regulating their very own affairs. If they get a lot of money from federal government, federal agencies have immense power without needing Congress to pass laws. If the court had stuck to its pre-1937 interpretation of the Constitution, the New Deal might have collapsed. The federal government would be smaller, and more power would remain in the states and with the individuals. Remember, it was for the people, by the people. And then the government became controlling over the people because of this 1937 Supreme Court ruling. Some conservatives and libertarians argue for a return to pre-1937 constitutional limits by challenging federal overreach in court. The current Supreme Court, with a conservative majority, is slowly reversing some, as we've seen in 2022 with Roe v. Wade, and EPA restrictions were rolled back in 2022 as well. Some states are trying to nullify strategies, refusing to enforce federal laws they see as unconstitutional. So I know that I've had questions asked, and I asked myself, what would happen without food stamps and the New Deal? Would people have suffered and died? Because, that's the history I was told. And that's a deep question. And the answer was really complex. If the New Deal had never happened after the Great Depression, and later if food stamps and other federal welfare programs had not been created, there would have been winners and there probably would have been losers, just in different ways. See, short term, yes, I'm sure that they would have suffered. I mean, it was the Great Depression. More people would have probably gone hungry and suffered extreme poverty. Without government programs, society may have developed different solutions as well, such as stronger local charity networks, mutual aid societies, or alternative economy policies, without breaking the Constitution, which some strongly believe was broke because of those amendments in 1937 ruling. The Great Depression without the New Deal. See, the New Deal was 1933 to 39. It was meant to pull America out of the Great Depression. But historians do argue it actually prolonged the suffering rather than fixed it. Possible outcomes without the New Deal? Well, not likely mass starvation. Churches would have kicked in. There was lots of churches then, lots of churches. Local charities and mutual aid groups were already, in fact, stepping in, and private food banks could have played a larger part. But instead, with that ruling, the government started kind of becoming the nanny state. Economic recovery. Some economists argue that FDR's government interventions actually slowed the recovery by discouraging private investments. Alternative solutions instead of massive government programs, businesses might have been forced to innovate faster, and wages could have naturally adjusted. So what did prolong the Great Depression? The New Deal's high taxes and regulations made businesses hesitant to hire, some say. The Supreme Court initially struck down many of the New Deal programs before the court shift that happened magically in 1937. And World War II, not the New Deal, is what a lot of history buffs actually say ended the Great Depression, as war created millions and millions of jobs. So would people have starved without food stamps? The food stamp program was created in 1939 and it became permanent in 1964 under LBJ's Great Society. Today it helps millions, but what if it had never existed? What would have happened instead? More private charity before the government stepped in. Churches, local food banks, and private organizations handled feeding the poor. Community-based aid, local farms, and there was a lot of them, and businesses often helped struggling neighbors. Lower taxes and more jobs, or lower taxes actually equal more jobs. Some argued that if businesses were not taxed so much to fund welfare, they would have hired more workers. Would have people starved? Well, sure, absolutely, they would have suffered, especially single moms and the elderly and the disabled without family support. But starvation widespread? Probably not, history buffs say, since local aid and self-sufficiency were much more common then. I mean, everybody had a garden, or at least everybody knew somebody who had a garden. The pros of welfare today, they believe that prevents starvation and extreme poverty for the most vulnerable, helps struggling families afford basic needs, and stimulates the economy by increasing consumer spending. The cons of welfare today creates a long-term dependency. Some people never get off assistance, discourages work. Food stamps and welfare benefits often reduce incentives to get a job. Massive government spending. Trillions are spent on welfare, increasing debt and inflation. Some studies actually show that private charity is much more effective than government welfare because private charity spends less on administration and helps people become more self-sufficient. Government programs often trap people in a cycle of poverty because they lose benefits if they start earning more. So would America be better off or worse off without the New Deal or welfare? In the short term, 1930 to 40s, yes, people would have probably suffered more. But I think they also, a lot of times if we don't suffer, we don't learn the lessons, right? But in the long term, America might have built a more self-sufficient society. Alternative timeline without government welfare. More local and church-based help. Instead of federal welfare, communities might have grown stronger aid systems. More jobs, less inflation. If the government had not spent trillions, inflation might be lower today. More independence, less dependency. Without government safety nets, people might have been driven to find work or create local support systems. A different approach to helping the poor. Instead of choosing between full government control or no help at all, a middle ground might work best. Some believe smaller, locally ran welfare programs instead of massive federal spending. Tax incentives for private charities to help people more. Programs that encourage work and self-sufficiency rather than long-term dependency. Can any president return us back to the Constitution before this law in 1937? Well, the power to unilaterally, just by yourself, return the government to a strict interpretation of the Constitution, the way they did from the founding 1776 to 1937. Well, turning us back to that is limited by several factors, including the separation of powers, existing laws, and the need for collaboration with other branches of government. Executive actions and their limits. Presidents can issue executive orders to direct the federal agencies and manage the operations within the executive branch. For instance, they can sign executive orders emphasizing that all federal agencies are accountable to the American people as required by the Constitution. This order highlights that Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution vests all executive power in the president, meaning that all executive branch officials and employees are subject to the president's supervision. And that is in the Amendment to U.S. Constitution. While such orders can influence the administration's direction, they cannot contravene existing laws or override judicial decision. Moreover, significant structure changes often require legislation approval and are subject to judicial review. Historically, efforts to realign federal power with strict constitutional interpretations have faced challenges. The balance of power between the federal and the state government has evolved, with certain powers becoming entrenched at the federal level. Reversing this trend typically is necessary for Congress to also, with the authority that's granted in Congress, to actually make it law. So there's checks and balances. And this is what FDR did, and he knew it, and that's why he threatened them that he was going to sack the court. And that's why they accepted, or Mr. Owens accepted, to redo his vote, and then allowed that to happen in 1937, which changed our whole Constitution. I mean, we lived under the same interpretation of the Constitution from 1776 to 1937. When you realize that, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but that blew my mind because I was not taught that. I was not taught about this. So, checks and balances are definitely there. The U.S. Constitution establishes a system of checks and balances to prevent any one branch from wielding excessive power. And FDR knew that, but he went to the Supreme Court and they overthrew it. And now we interpret the Constitution different. And now states have lost their power, and self-governance is not a thing anymore because people are looking for the government to step in and save them. Now, the president can advocate for a return to constitutional fundamentals before 1970 or before 1937, and such efforts would require, though, collaboration with Congress and are subject to judicial interpretation. So, in summary, while the president can take these steps to promote a government approach aligning with the interpretation of constitutional principles, the ability to comprehend and return to the Constitution involves navigating a complex interplay of executive action, legislative process, and judicial oversight. And that is what that would take. So hopefully you guys found this interesting. Check out the law yourself. I had no idea that we lived under the same Constitution. We lived under the same Constitution from 1776, the interpretation from then to 1937, and FDR, and that ruling, 1937, changed the way we do everything. When I found this out, I felt like I had been living under a lie, fabricated. Like I had no idea how much power the individual people had then. Now with power, as they say, with great power comes great responsibility. So I understand why FDR stuck in there and he said, Supreme Court, you need to overturn this. And we need to get the New Deal going. We need to get people working. I mean, they were coming out of the Great Depression. So I totally get it. And I can't imagine what he was faced with. I'm hopeful he was faced with that it was a good thing. I'm really hopeful that he was not thinking, that it was going to be took advantage of. I'm sure he couldn't think possibly and predict how people would be using that 1937 ruling to strip more and more of the Constitution away. I'm sure FDR just wanted to feed the people, get them back to work. I mean, after all, a lot of history buffs say he really did a lot of good. But regardless of what we think, if we want more power individually, we have more responsibility. If you want less of a nanny state, which seems to be a lot of what we're getting more and more of, we have to become more like our ancestors, a little more rugged, a little more self-reliant. Are we able to do that? Will society crash? Will it collapse? I think we all have a part to play. I think we really do. I think we're reliving Back to the Future. We're reliving part of history here. It's things that we just didn't know. I mean, things I didn't know. Maybe you guys did. Leave a comment if you did, because I did not know that our Constitution, basically by this one ruling, the FDR, I mean, he said, if you don't switch this, if the Supreme Court don't allow this in 1937, the New Deal to go through, he said he would stack the court. He was going to overturn it. But the Second and the 10th Amendment, the state rights, got threw out the window. And the federal government controls more and more of our lives every single year. I went through some of those today and how it changed history, even all the way up to today. Are we going back to before 1937? Power to the people, for the people? Government was for the people, by the people? Or are we going to grow into a bigger nanny state where the government tucks us in at night and takes care of everything? I think we all play a part to decide. Hope you guys have found this so interesting. I'll see you later.